My family always believed a person's worth lay in the designer label on their back. They didn't realize the woman adjusting the thermostat in the corner, the daughter they deemed a failure, had just closed the deal to buy this skyscraper with cash 15 minutes ago. My brother, Preston, sat there beaming, completely unaware he wasn't walking into a promotion ceremony, but into the trial of his life where I was the judge. My name is Nancy Willoughby, and to the 3 other people currently occupying the expansive executive conference room on the 42nd floor of the Sterling and Hart building. I was less significant than the potted ficus plant by the window. I stood in the far corner, my back pressed against the cool slate-gray wall, pretending to fiddle with the connection cables of the overhead projector. It was a practiced invisibility, a skill I had honed over 3 decades of being the disappointment in a family obsessed with appearances. I adjusted the focus on a lens that was already perfectly sharp, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that cut across the room like a spotlight waiting for a tragedy to unfold. The room itself was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. The table was a 20-foot slab of polished black marble that looked less like furniture and more like an altar for sacrificing ethics. The chairs were high-backed, upholstered in Italian leather that smelled of tannins and old money. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, a visual reminder that the people sitting in this room were above the common fray, literally and metaphorically. It was the kind of room designed to make you feel small if you didn't own it. My parents, Richard and Margaret Willoughby, certainly looked small. They had arrived 5 minutes ago, and despite their best efforts to project an air of nonchalant aristocracy, the cracks in their facade were visible to anyone who bothered to look closely. My father, Richard, was seated near the head of the table. He was wearing his best navy suit, the one he had bought 10 years ago when he still had a real portfolio to manage. Now, it hung slightly loose around his neck, a testament to the weight he had lost from stress. His hands were resting on the marble surface, but they weren't still. His fingers were drumming a frantic, silent rhythm, and every few seconds, he would reach down to touch the leather briefcase at his feet, as if reassuring himself that the bomb inside hadn't detonated yet. My mother, Margaret, was pacing. She stopped when she saw me checking the HDMI cable for the 3rd time. She marched over, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She was wearing a beige dress suit that she paired with a string of pearls that I knew were high-quality fakes because she had sold the real ones 2 years ago to cover the country club fees. "Nancy," she hissed, her voice low and laced with venom. "Look at you. We are about to meet the senior partners of a premier financial firm, and you are dressed like the help." I looked down at my attire. I was wearing a charcoal gray button-down shirt and black trousers. It was functional, clean, and professional. It was also the uniform of someone who gets things done, rather than someone who sits around talking about doing things. "I am just here to make sure the presentation works, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice devoid of emotion. "Preston asked me to help with the technical setup." "You are a disgrace," she muttered, turning her back on me to inspect her reflection in the darkened window glass. 30 years old and running errands, a low-level admin assistant. I told your father we shouldn't have let you come, but Preston insisted he needed someone to pour the coffee. Just try to blend into the wall. Nancy, don't embarrass your brother. He is on the verge of greatness, and the last thing he needs is his failure as a sister." Reminding everyone of our gene pool's shortcomings. I didn't respond. I walked over to the sidebar and began arranging the crystal glasses. Failure, I thought, the word tasting metallic in my mouth. Disgrace. If only she knew. They saw a secretary. They saw a woman who took the subway and lived in a walk-up apartment in Queens. They had no idea that the woman pouring their water was a ghost acquirer. They didn't know that for the past 5 years. Under the pseudonym of N. Holdings, I had been systematically identifying undervalued, distressed assets, stripping them of their toxic debt, and turning them around for massive profits. I wasn't an admin assistant. I was a shark who had learned to swim without making ripples. And Sterling and Hart. This wasn't a premier financial firm anymore. It was a hollow shell. A company I had quietly purchased the majority debt of 6 months ago. I owned the chairs they sat in. I owned the table my father was sweating on. I owned the lease on the building. I watched my father again. He had pulled a folder out of his briefcase and was staring at the papers inside, even from across the room. I recognized the distinct blue header of a property deed. He was shaking. It wasn't just nerves. It was the terror of a gambler who had pushed his last chip into the center of the table. He was leveraging the family home, the house where I grew up, the house they had threatened to kick me out of a dozen times, was about to be signed over to buy my brother a partnership that didn't exist. "Richard, put that away," my mother snapped, though her voice wavered. "You look desperate. We are the Willoughbys. We do not look desperate." "It's a lot of money, Margaret," my father whispered, his voice cracking. $200,000. It is everything. If this goes wrong—" "It won't go wrong," she interrupted fiercely. "Preston is a genius. He is just like you were in your prime. This is his moment. We just need to support him." I checked my watch, a simple black digital watch that my mother hated because it looked cheap. It was synced to the global market opening times. It was also counting down the minutes until my director of operations, James, would walk through that door and play the role I had scripted for him. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the entrance of the room burst open. The silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a smell, a cloud of cologne, something heavy, musky, and applied with enough enthusiasm to kill a small canary wafted into the room. Preston Willoughby made his entrance. My brother looked like a caricature of a Wall Street banker drawn by someone who had never actually met one. He was wearing a navy pinstripe suit that was cut too aggressively close to the body. Straining at the buttons, his hair was gelled back so severely it looked like a plastic helmet. On his wrist sat a gold chronograph watch that was almost certainly a high-grade replica, large enough to be used as a blunt weapon. He didn't walk. He strutted. He carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who has never had to face a consequence in his entire life because his parents were always there to write a check or make a phone call. He was beaming, a wide, toothy grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. His eyes were darting around the room, assessing the luxury, calculating how much of it he could claim credit for. "Welcome to the inner sanctum," Preston announced, spreading his arms wide as if he had built the skyscraper himself, brick by brick. "Did you see the lobby? Dad Italian marble floors, security scanners with facial recognition. This is the big leagues." "It is magnificent, son," my father said, standing up and buttoning his jacket with trembling fingers. "Truly magnificent." "Hey, you," Preston said, snapping his fingers in my direction without actually looking at me. "Nancy, get me some water. No gas. And make sure it is cold. I have been talking to investors all morning. My throat is dry." He tossed his leather portfolio onto the table with a thud. It slid across the polished surface and stopped inches from where my father stood. "Of course, Preston," I said. I poured the water. My hand was steady. As I walked over to place the glass in front of him, I looked at his face. I saw arrogance, yes, but underneath the layer of self-tanner and bravado, I saw the same fear I saw in my father. He knew he didn't have the money. He knew he was a fraud. He just didn't know that the person serving him water was the only one in the room who could see right through him. He took the glass without a thank you, turning his back to me to continue boasting to our parents. "Just wait until the senior partner gets here," Preston bragged, adjusting his cufflinks. He begged me to join, literally begged. Said the firm needs young blood, needs my vision. The $200,000 buy-in is just a formality. I will make that back in a week. I retreated to my corner. The invisible servant once more. I folded my hands behind my back and waited. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was wait for the cage to snap shut. "Did you see the beast parked out front?" Preston asked, spinning a key fob on his finger like a gunslinger holstering a weapon. "Porsche 911 GT3, lava orange. The dealership basically threw the keys at me when they heard about the Sterling and Hart deal. They said a man in my position needs a vehicle that screams power. It is a signing bonus, essentially. My mother gasped, clasping her hands together as if he had just announced he had cured a rare disease. "Oh, Preston, it is stunning. I told the valet to be careful with it. It suits you perfectly." I looked at the key fob. It was heavy and sleek, but I noticed the small, scuffed barcode sticker on the back that Preston had tried to peel off, but failed to remove entirely. It was a rental tag from a luxury leasing agency in New Jersey that specialized in renting supercars by the hour to rappers shooting music videos and influencers faking a lifestyle. He hadn't bought it. He hadn't been given it. He had rented it for 4 hours, likely putting the deposit on a credit card that was already gasping for air. This was the story of Preston's life, a narrative arc written entirely in the ink of deception. Since we were children, my parents had been the editors who erased his mistakes and rewrote his failures as triumphs. I remembered the time in high school when he drove my father's sedan through the neighbor's fence because he was high on cough syrup. My father didn't punish him. Instead, Richard paid the neighbor triple the cost of the fence to not file a police report, and then told everyone at the country club that Preston had swerved to avoid hitting a stray dog. A hero. He was always the hero in their version of reality. When he failed 3 semesters of college, my mother claimed the professors were jealous of his intellect and transferred him to a private institution where the tuition was high enough to guarantee a passing grade. They had spent a lifetime sweeping broken glass out of his path so he could walk barefoot without ever getting cut. Now, he stood there in a rented suit, talking about a rented car, about trying to buy his way into a company I owned, and they still saw him as the golden boy. "I assume you didn't drive, Nancy?" Preston turned his gaze toward me, his lip curling slightly. It was a reflexive sneer, one he had perfected over years of treating me like a staff member he couldn't fire. "Let me guess. The E-train. You smell like public transit. It is a distinct mix of stale air and mediocrity." "The subway is efficient," I said, my voice flat. I didn't mention that I had taken a private helicopter from the Hamptons to the city that morning and only took the subway 3 stops to maintain my cover. "Efficient?" Preston scoffed, shaking his head at our parents. "See, that is the problem. Small minds focus on saving $3. Big minds focus on generating 3 million. You will never understand the psychology of wealth. Nancy, you are too busy counting pennies while I am out here moving mountains." "He is right, Nancy," my father chimed in, leaning back in the leather chair, looking at his son with an adoration that bordered on religious worship. "Preston is a visionary. He reminds me of the tech giants, a young Musk or Zuckerberg. He understands that you have to spend money to make money. He is a disruptor. You are well. You are safe. There is nothing wrong with being safe, sweetie. But the world belongs to the bold." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. A disruptor. Preston had never disrupted anything except our family's financial stability. He had started 5 businesses in the last 6 years. There was the app that never launched, the energy drink that got sued for trademark infringement, and the cryptocurrency exchange that vanished overnight. Each time, my father dipped into his retirement savings to bail him out. Each time. They called it a learning experience rather than a catastrophe. "Speaking of bold," Preston said, lowering his voice to a confidential tone, leaning in toward the table. "The buy-in for the senior partner position, it is $200,000. I know it sounds like a lot, but for a firm like Sterling and Hart, it is peanuts. It is just a formality to prove I'm committed. Skin in the game." My mother nodded vigorously, though I saw her hand tighten around the strap of her purse. "It is a standard procedure, Richard. You know that. You have to invest in his future." Preston walked around the table and placed a hand on my mother's shoulder. He leaned down, and although he whispered, the acoustics of the empty room carried his voice directly to me. "Mom, listen to me. This deal, this is the one. This will save us. Once I am a partner, I will have access to the client accounts. The bonus structure is insane. I can pay back everything Dad liquidated. I can fix the house mortgage. I just need to get through this door." There it was. The confession. They were broke. I watched Preston's face as he pulled away from her. The smile was back in place, plastered on like a bumper sticker, but his eyes were darting around the room again. He was terrified. He didn't have $200,000. He probably didn't have $2,000. He was walking into this meeting intending to bluff his way through a financial transaction with a major corporation. He thought he could charm the board, maybe hand over a fake check, or delay the transfer until he could embezzle the funds from somewhere else. It was the desperate, flailing strategy of a man who had never been told no. He was betting everything on a lie, unaware that the house he was betting against was me. My smartwatch buzzed against my wrist. I glanced down discreetly. It was a message from my assistant, who was currently monitoring the building's security feeds and the network traffic. The prey is in the net. James is in the elevator. ET, 2 minutes. I looked up at my brother. He was adjusting his tie, checking his reflection in the polished marble of the table. He looked like a prince waiting to be crowned. I almost felt a pang of pity for him. It must be exhausting to be that hollow, to spend every waking moment inflating a balloon that was full of holes. But then I looked at my parents, looking at him with that blind, toxic pride, and the pity evaporated. They had created this monster. They had fed it, clothed it, and sacrificed their daughter to it. "Is the coffee coming?" Preston snapped, noticing I was standing still. "God, Nancy, you have one job. Try to look alive before the partners get here. You are bringing down the property value just standing there." "I will check on it," I said. I turned away so he wouldn't see the cold, hard satisfaction in my eyes. He thought he was the predator in this room because he was the loudest. He didn't realize that in nature, the most dangerous things are often the ones you never hear coming until their teeth are already in your throat. The trial was about to begin, and the defendant had just incriminated himself. The silence in the room stretched thin, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point, while my father nervously shuffled his papers and Preston checked his reflection in the back of a spoon. I found myself drifting away from the sterile luxury of the 42nd floor. The air conditioning hummed with a low, expensive purr, but my mind transported me back to a day that smelled of rain and wet asphalt. It was 8 years ago, my college graduation. I stood in a line of black-robed students, clutching a cap that I had decorated with cheap glitter glue because I wanted to feel festive despite the hollowness in my chest. When the dean announced my name, announcing that I was graduating summa cum laude with a double major in finance and economics, I paused. I instinctively looked toward the reserved seating section, the place where families cheered and waved signs. I knew the seats would be empty, yet some foolish, childlike part of me had hoped for a miracle. There was nothing but gray metal chairs. My parents were not there. They were 4,000 miles away in Saint-Tropez, celebrating Preston's 24th birthday. My mother had sent a text message that morning. It did not say congratulations. It said, "We hope you did not expect us to fly back for a ceremony that is just a formality. Preston is having a crisis about his quarter-life purpose, and he needs us. Do not be selfish. Nancy." Selfish. That word echoed in my head as I stood in the corner of the boardroom, watching the very people who had abandoned me. They had no idea that while Preston was having his crisis on a yacht, I was working 3 jobs simultaneously just to keep the lights on in my studio apartment. I smelled like fryer grease from the diner shift during the day, and I smelled of bleach from the janitorial shift I took at the library at night. Every single dollar of my student loans was paid by my own hands, which were cracked and bleeding from harsh chemicals. In contrast, Preston's quarter-life crisis was solved by my father writing a check for $50,000 so he could start a custom sneaker business. That business failed in 6 months because Preston spent the capital on launch parties rather than inventory. Then came the organic dog food delivery service, another $40,000, gone in 4 months. Then the tech incubator that never actually incubated anything other than his ego. I remembered a dinner conversation from 3 years ago, the last time I had asked my father for help. My car had broken down, and I needed $600 for a transmission repair so I could get to work. "Nancy," my father had said, cutting into his steak without looking at me. "You are a bad investment. We put money into you. And what do we get? A daughter who works clerical jobs. Preston, however, is a potential asset. When we pour capital into him, we are building a dynasty. You are just a sunk cost." A sunk cost. That was the phrase that finally killed the little girl inside me who just wanted her daddy to love her. It was the moment I stopped crying and started calculating. They saw me as a secretary. They saw a quiet, mousy woman who fetched coffee. They did not see an holdings. 5 years ago, I realized that my talent was not just in understanding numbers, but in understanding failure. I knew what desperation looked like because I had lived it. I started an holdings as a ghost consultancy. I specialized in distressed assets companies that were bleeding money, run by incompetent heirs or delusional CEOs. I bought their debt for pennies on the dollar. I restructured them. I stripped them of their dead weight. I became the grim reaper of the corporate world, and I was very, very good at my job. Which brought us to Sterling and Hart. Preston, in his infinite arrogance, believed this firm was the pinnacle of success. He saw the marble floors and the view and assumed it was a gold mine. He did not look at the balance sheet. If he had, he would have seen a company that had not turned a profit in 3 years. He would have seen that the senior partners he was so desperate to impress were actually scrambling to find a bailout because the SEC was investigating their liquidity. Sterling and Hart was a corpse that had been dressed up in a tuxedo. It was a hollow shell. And 2 months ago, N. Holdings had quietly purchased every single outstanding loan this company had. I looked at the mahogany table where my brother sat. He thought he was buying a partnership. In reality, he was buying a ticket onto a sinking ship that I had already torpedoed. I was not just an employee here, I was the sole creditor. Legally speaking, I owned the chairs they sat on, the water they drank, and the very air they were so pompously breathing. The bitterness that used to choke me had vanished. It had been replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. There was no anger left in my heart, only the precise, mechanical ticking of a clock. I looked at my mother, who was nervously adjusting her pearls, and felt absolutely nothing. No love, no hate, just the indifference of a scientist observing bacteria in a petri dish. "Nancy," Preston's voice snapped across the room like a whip. "Are you deaf?" I said, "Check on the coffee, and see if they have those little almond biscotti. The senior partners will expect refreshments." He gestured dismissively with his hand, shooing me away as if I were a stray dog begging for scraps. "Right away, Preston," I said softly. I turned toward the service door. He had no idea. He sat there, terrified of meeting the board of directors, terrified that his fraud would be discovered. He did not know that at 8 o'clock this morning, I had signed a digital executive order dissolving the entire board of directors for gross negligence. There were no senior partners coming. There was no one left to impress. The only authority in this building was the woman he had just sent to fetch a cookie. I walked into the small kitchenette adjacent to the conference room and stared at the coffee machine. I listened to the hiss of the steam. It sounded like a warning. The stage was set. The players were in position. My family thought they were here to witness a coronation. They were about to witness an execution. And the most beautiful part was that they had signed the death warrant themselves, years ago. When they decided that one child was a king and the other was a servant, I picked up the silver tray, arranged the cups with military precision, and prepared to serve them their final meal. The heavy double doors of the conference room did not just open. They were thrust inward with a force that commanded immediate silence. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. James entered. To the world outside this room, James was my chief legal counsel, a brilliant but mild-mannered man who enjoyed jazz vinyls and gardening, but today he had vanished. In his place stood a man who looked like he ate steel for breakfast and washed it down with crude oil. He was wearing a bespoke 3-piece suit in a shade of black so deep it seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was slicked back with severe precision, and his eyes behind his rimless glasses were cold, hard, and utterly devoid of humanity. He carried nothing but a sleek, silver metal case. The effect on my family was instantaneous. It was pathetic. Preston scrambled to his feet so fast his chair screeched against the floor. A jagged sound that made my mother wince. My father, Richard, buttoned his jacket with trembling fingers, adjusting his posture to look like a man of importance rather than a man on the brink of ruin. "Mr. Sterling," Preston exclaimed, his voice cracking slightly on the second syllable. He stepped forward, extending his hand with a desperate eagerness, his rented luxury watch glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "It is an absolute honor. I am Preston Willoughby. We spoke on the—" James did not slow down. He did not look at Preston's extended hand. He did not even look at Preston's face. He walked straight through the space my brother was occupying, forcing Preston to awkwardly step aside to avoid a collision. It was a power move so brutal in its simplicity that I almost smiled. James walked to the head of the massive marble table, the seat of authority, and pulled out the leather chair. He sat down with a slow, deliberate grace, placing his silver case on the table in front of him. My father, who had also risen to his feet, stood there with his mouth slightly open, his hand hovering in midair like a confused ghost. "Sit down," James said. His voice was not loud, but it had the density of lead. It was a command, not a request. Preston and Richard collapsed into their chairs as if their strings had been cut. The silence that followed was agonizing. James took a moment to scan the room, his gaze sweeping over them with a look of bored disdain. When his eyes passed over me standing in the corner with the coffee tray, he didn't even blink. I was a lamp. I was a rug. I was nothing. He was playing his part perfectly. Then, James did something that shifted the atmosphere from uncomfortable to terrifying. He opened the silver case. He did not pull out a laptop or a stack of contracts. He pulled out a large digital countdown timer. It was the kind used in competitive chess or bomb disposal drills. He placed it in the center of the table, facing my brother. With a single, sharp movement of his index finger, he hit the start button. Beep! The red numbers began to tick down. 10:00, 9:59, 9:58. Time is money. "Gentlemen," James said, leaning back and tenting his fingers, "and you are currently wasting mine. You have exactly 10 minutes to prove to me that you are not a waste of my capital. If the clock hits 0 and I am not impressed, security will escort you out. Am I clear?" The color drained from Preston's face so completely, he looked like a wax figure left out in the sun. My father looked as if he was having a cardiac event. This was not the friendly, backslapping corporate welcome they had fantasized about. This was an interrogation. My mother, sensing the sudden spike in danger, turned her head sharply toward me. Her eyes were wide with panic. She made a frantic shooing motion with her hand, mouthing the words at me with intense ferocity. "Get back. Get in the corner. You are in the eye line. Do not ruin this." She wanted me to disappear. She believed that my presence, my cheap clothes, my very existence as her failure daughter, was the variable that might upset this delicate equation. I obeyed. I took 2 steps back, retreating into the shadows of the room, clutching the silver tray against my chest like a shield. From my vantage point, I had the perfect angle to watch the slaughter. "Mr. Sterling, Preston stammered, his confident facade crumbling like wet sand. "We thought this was a signing ceremony. The preliminary discussions were—" "I don't care what you thought," James interrupted, his voice slicing through Preston's stutter. "This is a volatile market. Conditions change. Assessments are reevaluated. I have looked at your file. Mr. Willoughby, it is colorful." James picked up a single sheet of paper from the table, a blank piece of paper. I knew and pretended to read it. He frowned. "You claim to have the liquidity to join the senior partnership tier," James said, dropping the paper back onto the table. "That requires a buy-in fee of $200,000, immediate transfer, today, now." He stared at Preston. "Show me the money." The air in the room became heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the clock. 9 minutes and 20 seconds, 9 minutes and 19 seconds. Preston swallowed hard. I could see the muscles in his throat constrict. He looked at our father for help, but Richard was staring at the table, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Preston was alone. He turned his attention to his briefcase, a gaudy, crocodile skin monstrosity that he had bought on credit last week. He reached for the latches. His hands were shaking. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was a violent vibration. His fingers slipped off the gold-plated latch twice before he managed to grip it. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead, right at the hairline. A single drop broke free and rolled down his temple, cutting a track through his bronzer. Click, click. The sound of the latches opening echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. I knew exactly what was in that briefcase. There was no cashier's check. There was no verified wire transfer confirmation. There were photocopied documents he had forged. There were bank statements he had edited with amateur software to add zeros to the balance. There was a desperate hope that he could talk his way around the transaction, that he could charm this CEO into giving him a grace period. But looking at James, looking at the stone-faced executioner sitting opposite him, Preston realized that charm was not a currency accepted here. "I have the preliminary allocation documents right here," Preston said, his voice an octave higher than usual. He opened the lid of the briefcase, using it as a barrier between him and James, trying to hide his trembling hands. "I don't want documents," James said, checking his own watch, ignoring the countdown timer as if to show he had his own time zone. "I want proof of funds. You said you were ready to play in the big leagues. Preston, well, the game has started. You have 8 minutes left. Make me believe you are worth $200,000. I watched my brother pull a sheaf of papers from the briefcase. The paper stock was high quality. He had at least spent money on that, but the hands holding it were weak. He placed the stack on the marble table and slid it toward James. He did it slowly, as if the paper was radioactive. "Here," Preston whispered. "This shows the assets." James did not reach for the papers immediately. He let them sit there. He looked at the papers, then he looked at the countdown timer, and finally, he looked at Preston. The silence stretched out again, cruel and infinite. I leaned forward slightly in my corner. This was it. The moment the lie met the light. Preston was trying to pass off monopoly money as legal tender, and he was doing it in front of the one man who had been instructed to tear him apart. My heart wasn't racing. It was beating with a slow, heavy thud of anticipation. I watched the sweat drip from Preston's chin and splash onto the expensive leather of the table. He was drowning, and I was in the ocean. The sheet of paper that Preston slid across the black marble table was a work of art. In the same way a counterfeit Monet is a work of art. It was printed on heavy cream-colored bond paper that felt substantial between the fingers. The logo of a major national bank was embossed in the upper left corner. Vibrant in its trademark blue and red, the font was perfectly matched to the bank's official typeface, a detail that most forgers missed, but Preston had evidently spent hours perfecting. Center stage on the document, bolded and highlighted in a subtle gray box, was the figure $250,000 and 0 cents. It was a beautiful lie. It represented a safety net, a future, and a level of success that my brother had never actually earned. He pushed it toward James with a mixture of defiance and relief, his chest heaving slightly, as if he had just physically carried the gold bullion into the room himself. "There," Preston said, his voice gaining a fraction of its usual swagger. "As you can see, the liquidity is there, $250,000. That is $50,000 over the buy-in requirement, just to show good faith. I like to keep a healthy buffer for operational expenses." My parents exhaled in unison. My father, Richard, slumped back in his chair, the tension draining from his shoulders. He looked at the paper with a reverence one usually reserves for religious texts. To him, that piece of paper was salvation. It was proof that his golden boy was indeed golden. James did not pick up the paper. He didn't even look at the numbers. He stared at the sheet with the kind of distaste one might show a used tissue. With the tip of his index finger, he pushed the paper back across the slippery surface of the table until it rested on the edge. half hanging off, threatening to flutter to the floor. "Paper," James said, the word dripping with disdain. "Mr. Willoughby, you seem to be laboring under a misconception about Sterling and Hart. We are a FinTech 4.0 enterprise. We deal in blockchain, algorithmic trading, and nanosecond discrepancies. Paper is for dinosaurs. Paper can be printed by any teenager with Photoshop and a laser jet." Preston's smile froze. The corner of his mouth twitched. Excuse me. "I don't accept static documentation," James continued, his voice monotone and relentless. "I need real-time verification, digital authentication. If that money is in your account, it is on the server. I want to see the live feed. Log into your banking portal, now." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the projector fan overhead and the distant wail of a siren 42 floors below. Preston laughed, but it was a brittle, fractured sound. "Log in here. That seems highly irregular. Security protocols. I don't typically access sensitive accounts on unsecured networks." "Our network is encrypted with military-grade protocols," James countered immediately. "It is more secure than the Pentagon, unless, of course, the money isn't there." Preston shifted in his seat. The leather squeaked, sounding like a whimpering animal. No, of course it is there. It is just the bank. Yes, the bank. I received a notification earlier. Their system is down for scheduled maintenance. Terrible timing. Really, routine updates. You know how it is with these legacy institutions." He looked around the room, begging for someone to believe him. "It is likely to be down for another 2 hours. Perhaps we can proceed with the signing, and I will email the digital token later." This was the moment. The opening was so wide I could have driven a truck through it. I stepped forward from my corner, clasping my hands in front of my apron, projecting the image of the helpful, slightly dim-witted sister trying to aid her brilliant brother. "Oh, Preston," I said, my voice bright and innocent. "That is strange. I use the same bank. Remember, I just checked my balance on my phone 5 minutes ago to see if my paycheck cleared. The app is working perfectly. The system is super fast today." Preston's head snapped toward me. If looks could incinerate, I would have been a pile of ash on the carpet. His eyes bulged, the veins in his neck popping out against his collar. He bared his teeth slightly, a feral expression of pure hatred. He wanted to scream at me to shut up, to strangle me, to throw me out of the room. But he couldn't. Not in front of James. Not in front of the man he was trying to impress. He was trapped in his own suit, paralyzed by the presence of the CEO. "And," I continued, turning to James with a helpful smile, "the Wi-Fi here is excellent. Sir, it is gigabit fiber. I can help Preston connect his laptop to the main screen. That way, you can see everything clearly. It is just an HDMI connection. I set it up myself." "Excellent suggestion," James said, locking eyes with Preston. "The assistant is right. No more excuses. Mr. Willoughby, the technology works. The bank works. The only variable is you." My father, oblivious to the fact that his son was currently hyperventilating, leaned forward. He saw this as a chance to show off. "Go ahead. Son, do it. Show Mr. Sterling the Willoughby financial might. Put it on the big screen. Let's dazzle him." "Dad, I don't think—" Preston started, his voice a strangled whisper. "Nonsense," Richard boomed, slapping the table. "Don't be modest. Connect the computer. Let's get this done." Preston was cornered. He looked at the door, but security guards were posted outside. He looked at the window, but it was a long way down. He had no choice. With the jerky movements of a marionette being controlled by a drunk puppeteer, he reached down and hoisted his slim laptop onto the table. He opened the lid. His fingers danced over the keyboard, but they were clumsy. I watched him fumble with the HDMI cable I had conveniently left in the center of the table. He tried to jam it into the USB port first, his panic making him lose basic motor skills. Finally, he found the correct port. Click. The large screen behind him flickered to life. It mirrored his desktop. I watched him closely. I knew exactly what he was doing because I knew how a liar's mind worked. He could not open a web browser. If he opened Chrome or Safari and typed in the bank's URL, he would have to log in, and if he logged in, the screen would display his actual balance, $42 and some change. He couldn't risk the inspect element trick to edit the HTML because that took time and steady hands, neither of which he had right now. So he went for the amateur magician's trick. He moved his mouse cursor quickly, avoiding the taskbar where the browser icons lived. He navigated straight to his file explorer. I saw the directory flash on the big screen for a split second, document/fake/sterling_deal. The folder name alone was enough to indict him, but he clicked through it so fast he hoped James wouldn't notice. He found a file named current_balance_verified.pdf. He double-clicked it. But he didn't just open it. He immediately hit the shortcut key for full screen mode to hide the PDF viewer's toolbar and the window borders. On the giant projection screen, the image filled the entire visual field. It looked like a web page. It had the navigation bar at the top, the logout button in the corner, and the live chat icon at the bottom, and in the center, large and commanding, was the number $250,000. To the uninitiated, it looked like he was browsing the live site. It was a screenshot he had taken days ago, edited in Photoshop, and saved as a PDF presentation. He sat back, wiping a sheen of sweat from his upper lip, and gestured to the screen. "There," Preston said, his voice trembling but triumphant. "Live access, as requested, $250,000, ready for transfer." He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system. He didn't realize that presenting a static image to a man pretending to be a tech mogul was like trying to sell a drawing of a horse to a jockey. He had just walked directly into the kill box. James leaned forward, his eyes narrowing behind his rimless glasses as he scrutinized the projection screen. He did not look impressed. He looked like a predator inspecting a piece of meat to see if it was spoiled. He tapped his index finger against the polished obsidian surface of the table. A slow, rhythmic sound that echoed in the silence of the room. "The resolution is adequate," James said, his voice devoid of warmth. "But in the era of deepfakes and digital manipulation, visual confirmation is merely the first step. I need forensic verification." He paused, letting the words hang in the air before delivering the command that would seal my brother's fate. "Email that file to me. Mr. Willoughby, right now. My security team needs to run a hash scan on the document's metadata to verify the timestamp and the originating server signature. If it is legitimate, the cryptographic hash will match the bank's public key." I watched Preston's throat bob as he swallowed a lump of pure terror. He had no idea what a hash scan was. To be fair, in this context, James was making up half the terminology, stringing together buzzwords to create a wall of intimidation. But the technical gibberish served a very specific, very lethal purpose. This was the trap. This was the point of no return. Standing in the shadows of the corner, I tightened my grip on the silver serving tray until my knuckles turned white. I needed to keep my face completely neutral. But inside, my mind was racing through the federal statutes I had memorized for this exact moment. You see, standing in a room and lying to someone is a moral failing. It is unethical, but it is rarely a felony. If Preston simply showed the picture and we walked away, the worst he would face is humiliation. But the moment he attached that file to an email and hit send, the game changed entirely. Electronic transmission, interstate commerce, intent to defraud. By emailing a forged financial document to secure a business position involving monetary transaction, Preston would be crossing the line into Title 18 United States Code, Section 1343, wire fraud. It was a federal crime that carried a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. He wasn't just lying to a potential boss anymore. He was manufacturing evidence for his own prosecution. The email server might be slow," Preston stammered, his hand hovering over the trackpad of his laptop. "Big files. You know, it might get stuck in the outbox." "It is a PDF, Mr. Willoughby," James said, checking his watch again. "It is less than 2 megabytes. It will travel at the speed of light. Send it, now, or get out of my office." The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Preston looked at the laptop screen. I could see the reflection of the fake bank statement in his eyes. He was trembling. His cursor was shaking on the screen, dancing around the attach icon. He knew, deep down in his lizard brain, the part responsible for survival. He knew he was making a mistake. He knew that sending this file was creating a paper trail that could never be erased. I watched the internal struggle play out on his face. It was a battle between fear and greed. Fear told him to close the laptop, apologize, and run out of the building. Fear told him to admit he didn't have the money, but greed whispered that he was special. Greed told him that he had always gotten away with everything because he was Preston Willoughby. Greed told him that James wouldn't actually check the metadata, that this was just a bluff, and that if he just pushed the button, he would walk out of here a senior partner. And then there was the pride. He looked at our father, Richard, who was giving him a double thumbs up, beaming with the naive confidence of a man who believed his son could walk on water. Preston couldn't bear to shatter that illusion. He couldn't bear to be seen as a failure. Greed and pride won. They always do with men like him. Preston took a deep breath, a shaky, rattling inhale that sounded like a death rattle. He moved the cursor. He clicked attach. He selected the file. He typed in the email address. James had provided an internal address that routed directly to the CEO's secure inbox. He hovered over the blue send button. "We are waiting, Preston," James said, his voice sharp as a whip crack. Preston closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and then, with a jab of his index finger, he hit the enter key. Whoosh! The default sound effect of the mail application filled the room. It was a soft, airy sound, like a gust of wind. But to me, it sounded like the heavy metallic clang of a prison cell door slamming shut. It sounded like the gavel of a judge hitting the sounding block. The deed was done. The crime was committed. It was recorded, time-stamped, and archived. A split second later, a subtle vibration buzzed against my ribs. My phone, tucked deep inside the inner pocket of my utility apron, came to life. I didn't need to look at it. I knew exactly what the notification said. As the actual owner of the domain and the true CEO of this company, all executive emails were mirrored to my device. I had just received a file named current_balance_verified.pdf from Willoughby_entrepreneur@gmail.com. The evidence was in my pocket. James looked down at the tablet lying flat on the table in front of him. He tapped the screen once, then twice. A small green light blinked on the device. "Received," James stated flatly. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply stared at the tablet for a moment, as if processing the data, before looking back up at Preston. "The file is in our system. The legal team has begun the verification process. This will take 24 hours to fully clear, of course." The tension in the room snapped like a cut wire. "Oh, thank God." My mother, Margaret, exhaled, pressing her hand to her chest. She slumped against her husband, letting out a laugh that bordered on hysterical. "I told you, Richard, I told you he could do it. It was just a technical glitch." "Well done, son, well done," Richard boomed, his face flushing red with relief. He reached over and slapped Preston on the back so hard the brother nearly face-planted into his laptop. "That is the Willoughby spirit, never back down from a challenge. You showed them. You showed them the money." Preston slumped in his chair, wiping a layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked exhausted, drained, but also triumphant. A smirk began to creep back onto his face. He thought he had survived. He thought he had successfully navigated the minefield. "I told you, Mr. Sterling," Preston said, his voice returning to its usual arrogant drawl, though it was still a bit raspy. "My assets are solid. I am ready to take this firm to the next level. You won't regret bringing me on board." "I am sure I won't," James said, and for the first time, a small, icy smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a spider watching a fly struggle in silk. We value transparency above all else here. I stood in the corner, watching my family celebrate. They were high-fiving. They were laughing. They were already mentally spending the money they thought Preston was going to earn. They had no idea that they were celebrating their own destruction. They were standing on the deck of the Titanic, cheering as the iceberg scraped along the hull. Convinced that the shudder they just felt was merely the engines shifting into high gear. The silence of the room returned, but now it felt different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore. It was the silence of a tomb. The trap had been sprung, the lock had been engaged, and the key was in my pocket. All that was left now was to let them dig their graves just a little bit deeper. The celebration was short-lived. It lasted exactly 7 seconds, the time it took for James to clear his throat. The sound was dry and sharp, like a boot crushing a dry leaf, effectively silencing the premature congratulations echoing around the marble walls. "Hold your applause," James said, not looking up from his tablet. He swiped across the screen with a deliberate, slicing motion. As I mentioned, the digital verification process is rigorous. Due to federal banking regulations regarding transfers over $10,000, and considering the unique nature of the file format you provided, the funds will be placed in a mandatory escrow holding pattern. He looked up then, locking eyes with Preston. "It takes 24 hours to clear. The money is in the ether. Mr. Willoughby, it is not yet in our accounts." Preston's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching downward. 24 hours. But that is just a formality, right? You have the file. You have the proof. "I have a PDF," James corrected coldly. "I do not have cash, and this brings us to a significant problem." He leaned back, tapping his fingers together. "The senior partner position is a time-sensitive opening. The board meets tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. If the funds are not fully cleared and liquid by close of business today, I cannot hold the seat for you. I have 3 other candidates, Harvard graduates with cash in hand, waiting in the lobby." The lie was smooth, seamless, and devastating. There were no candidates, there was no board, but the fear of missing out, the fear of losing the prize when it was inches from his fingertips, sent a jolt of panic through my brother that was visible to the naked eye. "You can't give it away," Preston half shouted, standing up and leaning over the table. "We have a deal. I sent the email." "Policy is policy," James said, his voice bored. "Unless—" He let the word hang there, a lifeline dangled over a shark tank. "Unless what?" my father asked, his voice hoarse. Richard Willoughby looked 10 years older than he had when he walked in. His skin was pasty, and there was a tremor in his hands that he was trying desperately to hide by gripping the edge of the table. James reached into his silver metal case one last time. He pulled out a document bound in a blue legal folder. He slid it across the long, black table. It stopped perfectly in front of my father. "Collateral," James said. "To hold the position until the wire transfer clears tomorrow, I need a tangible asset guarantee, something of equal or greater value to the buy-in fee. It is a standard bridge agreement. Once the $250,000 clears tomorrow, this contract is voided and returned to you, shredded, non-binding after 24 hours. My father opened the folder. I saw the blood drain from his face until he looked like a corpse propped up in a suit. "This," Richard stammered, his eyes darting across the legal text. "This is a deed transfer. For the house. Our house." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush lungs. The house, the sprawling Victorian estate in Westchester, it was the only thing they had left. The stocks were gone. The savings were drained. The retirement accounts had been raided to pay for Preston's previous failures. That house was their sanctuary, their last shred of status, the only thing standing between them and the reality of their financial ruin. "It is the only asset listed in your portfolio with sufficient equity," James said, checking his watch again. 7 minutes remaining on the clock. "Gentlemen, if you are confident the money is real, then this is just a piece of paper. You sign it, we hold it for one night, and we tear it up tomorrow. No risk. Unless, of course, the money isn't coming. It was the ultimate gambler's paradox. To refuse to sign was to admit the money was fake. To sign was to risk everything on a lie. Preston turned to our father. I watched the gears turn in his head. He knew the money wasn't coming. He knew that in 24 hours, the fraud would be exposed, but his narcissism was a powerful drug. He convinced himself in that second that he could fix it. He thought he could sign the house away now, get the partnership, and then somehow miraculously talk his way out of it tomorrow. Or maybe he just didn't care. Maybe he was willing to burn his parents' roof to keep his own ego warm for one more day. "Dad," Preston whispered, his voice trembling with urgency. "Dad, sign it. You have to sign it." Richard looked up at his son, his eyes wet with fear. "Preston, it is the house. It is all we have. If something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Preston hissed, grabbing his father's arm. "Listen to me. The money is there. It is just a banking glitch. Tomorrow morning, it clears, and we tear this up. Think about the upside. Dad, once I'm a partner, I am going to be making $500,000 a year. Base salary. I will buy you a new house. Better than that old drafty place. I will get you a penthouse in Miami. Ocean view. You and Mom can retire in style. Just trust me." Trust him. The phrase was a joke. Trusting Preston was like trusting a pyromaniac with a book of matches in a library. My father wavered. He looked at the document, then at his son. He was looking for permission to be reckless. He turned to my mother. Margaret was staring at the deed with a hungry, desperate look. She didn't see the risk. She only saw the status. She saw the senior partner title. She saw the Miami penthouse Preston was spinning out of thin air. "Richard, for heaven's sake," she snapped. "Do not be a coward. Preston has worked so hard for this. Are you going to let a little paperwork stand in the way of our family's destiny as the paper?" Then, she turned her eyes to me. I was still standing in the corner, silent, watching the train wreck in slow motion. Her gaze was filled with a cold, piercing resentment. She needed someone to blame for the tension in the room, and I was the eternal scapegoat. "Don't look at her," Margaret spat at Richard, though he hadn't even glanced my way. "She is probably hoping you don't sign it. She wants us to fail. Look at her, standing there like a statue. Useless. If you had half the ambition, half the talent of your brother, we wouldn't be in this position. Nancy, we wouldn't have to leverage our home if you had made something of yourself instead of settling for whatever this is." She gestured vaguely at my outfit, at my existence. "If you were a good daughter," she continued, her voice rising, "you would have offered to help. But no, you just take. Preston is the only one giving back to this family." The words hit me like physical blows, but I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. Inside, a part of me finally died the part that still hoped, against all logic, that they might love me. It withered away and turned to dust. In its place, the cold steel of my resolve hardened. If I were a good daughter, I thought, a good daughter wouldn't let her parents sign away their home to a shark. But I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was the shark. I remained silent. I kept my face blank, a perfect mask of the useless secretary they believed me to be. Richard took a deep breath. The pressure from his wife and son was too much. His vanity was too fragile. He picked up the heavy fountain pen James had left on the table. The nib hovered over the signature line. "For the partnership," Richard whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "For the family legacy." He signed. The scratching of the pen against the paper sounded like a knife carving into bone. He signed his name with a flourish, the last act of a man who thought he was a king but was actually a jester. He pushed the folder back to James. James didn't hesitate. He picked up a heavy red rubber stamp from his desk. He inked it. He brought it down on the document with a force that shook the table. Thud. The word received appeared in bold, red ink across the deed. "Excellent," James said, closing the folder and sliding it into his metal case. The snap of the case locking was the final punctuation mark on their life as they knew it. The house was gone. It legally belonged to Sterling and Hart now. It belonged to me. "Congratulations, Mr. Willoughby, James said, standing up, you have secured your position, for now. My father slumped in his chair, wiping sweat from his upper lip, looking like he might vomit. Preston, however, let out a whoop of joy, punching the air. I knew it. I knew you had the guts. Dad, Preston crowed. Miami, here we come. I watched them. I watched the tragedy and the farce intertwined. They thought the ordeal was over. They thought they had passed the test. They had no idea that the real test had ended 10 minutes ago, and they had all failed. Now, it was time for the sentencing phase. Preston, I said quietly. My voice was low, but in the sudden quiet of the room, it carried, "Shut up, Nancy," Preston laughed, turning to grab his briefcase. "Don't ruin the mood. Go clean up those coffee cups. I have big business to discuss with my new partner." "No," I said, louder this time. I took a step forward. Emerging from the shadows of the corner, the submissive posture was gone. The useless daughter mask was slipping off. I walked toward the table, my heels clicking on the floor with a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a countdown reaching 0. "I don't think you do." "So, that is settled then," Preston declared, leaning back in his chair and clasping his hands behind his head. The sweat was still drying on his forehead, but the smirk had returned, wider and more obnoxious than before. He looked like a man who had just cheated death and convinced himself it was skill. "We will sort out the wire transfer details in the morning. Now, if you will excuse us, Mr. Sterling and I have a high-level strategy to discuss. Global markets, mergers, that sort of thing." He turned his head slightly, snapping his fingers in my direction without actually making eye contact. "Nancy, be a dear and clear the table. Will you get rid of these water glasses? They are cluttering up the workspace, and once you are done, wait in the hall. We need confidentiality. This is executive talk, not secretarial gossip." My mother, Margaret, was already reaching for her purse, looking relieved. "Come along, Nancy. Do as your brother says. Don't be an obstruction. We should let the men work." I did not move toward the door. I did not pick up the empty glasses. Instead, I walked slowly toward the head of the table, moving with a predator's grace that I had suppressed for 3 hours. I held the heavy crystal water pitcher in my right hand. It was solid lead crystal, weighing nearly 5 pounds. I stopped directly between Preston and James. "Nancy, did you hear me?" Preston snapped, his voice rising with irritation. "I said clear the—" Clack! I slammed the heavy pitcher down onto the black marble table. The sound was not a tinkling of glass. It was a violent, authoritative thud that vibrated through the furniture. Water sloshed over the rim and pooled onto the polished stone, soaking the edge of Preston's sleeve. The room went dead silent. Preston jumped, pulling his arm back as if he had been burned. "What the hell is wrong with you? You almost cracked the table. This is Italian marble. You idiot." I ignored him. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out my smartphone. It wasn't the cracked, outdated model I usually carried when I visited my parents. This was my work phone, a sleek, encrypted device that served as the master key to my entire digital infrastructure. "Actually," I said, my voice was no longer the soft, trembling whisper of the dutiful daughter. It was deep, resonant, and cold. It was the voice I used to negotiate hostile takeovers. It was the voice that made grown men in boardrooms stutter. "This meeting is not over. In fact, it has not even started." "Nancy, stop embarrassing us," my father hissed, looking terrified that James might rescind the deal because of my behavior. "Apologize to Mr. Sterling immediately." I tapped a single icon on my screen. Override Authorization Alpha 1. On the wall behind Preston, the massive projection screen flickered. The image of his fraudulent PDF bank statement, the one showing the fake $250,000, glitched. Static cut across the screen for a fraction of a second, tearing through his lie. Then, the screen went black. A moment later, a new image resolved itself in high-definition 4K resolution. It was a corporate organizational chart. It was complex. a web of subsidiaries and holding companies, but the hierarchy was unmistakable. At the very top of the pyramid, in a box highlighted in gold, was the parent company N Holdings. Directly underneath it, connected by a solid black line, was the subsidiary Sterling and Hart Financial Group. And inside the box at the pinnacle, the name of the chairman of the board and sole proprietor was written in bold, capital letters. Nancy Willoughby. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens after a bomb goes off, before the screaming starts. It was a vacuum of oxygen. Preston stared at the screen. He squinted, he blinked, he tilted his head. His brain was refusing to process the visual data because it contradicted every single truth he had constructed about his life. "What is this?" Preston laughed nervously, gesturing at the screen. "Is this a joke? Did you hack the projector?" "Nancy, very funny. Did you type your name in there, Dad? Look at this. She thinks she is funny." My father was not laughing. Richard was staring at the screen with his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked from the screen to me, and then back to the screen. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful for him. He saw the logo, he saw the structure, and he saw the name of the daughter he had called a bad investment, sitting at the top of the food chain. "Nancy," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you do?" I did not answer her. I turned my head slowly toward James. James was still sitting at the head of the table, his face an impassive mask of stone. He looked at me, and then, very deliberately, he stood up. "Thank you, James," I said, my tone casual but commanding. "The performance was adequate. You leaned a little hard on the villain trope in the second act, but it got the job done. The man my family thought was Mr. Sterling, the man they had been groveling to, the man they feared turned to me." He buttoned his suit jacket, straightened his tie, and bowed his head in a gesture of deep, genuine respect. "My apologies, Ms. Willoughby," James said, his voice shedding the harsh, gravelly tone of the character and returning to his natural, polite cadence. "I wanted to ensure the pressure was sufficient to force the signature. Everything went according to your plan, boss." "Boss?" Preston choked out the word. He looked like he had been slapped. Wait a minute. He calls you boss." James picked up the silver metal case, the one containing the signed deed to my parents' house, and walked around the table. He stopped in front of me and held the case out with two hands. "The asset is secured, ma'am," James said. "The deed is notarized and stamped. The property is now legally part of the WW Holdings real estate portfolio." I took the case. It felt heavy. It felt like justice. "Excellent work, James," I said. "You can drop the act now. Go wait in my office. I need to handle personnel issues." "Personnel issues," Preston sputtered. He stood up, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. "I am the personnel. I am the new senior partner. We have a deal. I signed the papers." I turned to face my brother. I looked him up and down, letting my gaze linger on his cheap rental suit, his fake watch, and his sweaty, terrified face. I let the mask fall completely. There was no more sisterly affection, no more patience. There was only the cold, hard reality of the market. I walked over to the head of the table, the seat James had vacated. I sat down. I placed the silver case on the table in front of me and rested my hands on top of it. "You signed a transfer of deed," I corrected him. "You gave me your house. You did not get a partnership. Do you know why?" "Because the money takes 24 hours to clear," Preston shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He said so. And who are you to sit there? Get out of that chair." "Nancy, you are going to get us all thrown out." "The money will never clear, Preston," I said softly, "because I know exactly how much money is in that account. $42. I know because I own the debt collection agency that has been garnishing your wages for the last 6 months. I know every cent you have, and every cent you don't have." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. "Sterling and Hart is mine," I said. enunciating every syllable. I bought the debt. I bought the building. I bought the brand. I own the chairs you are sitting on. I own the water you just spilled. And as of 5 minutes ago, when you signed that document, I owned the roof over your head. My mother let out a strangled sob. Nancy, you bought the company, but how you are a secretary. I am a ghost acquirer, I said, not looking at her. I fix broken things, or I sell them for scrap, and right now, I am looking at 3 very broken assets. I gestured around the room, encompassing the 3 of them. So, I said, a small, cruel smile playing on my lips. To answer your question, Preston, no, you are not a senior partner. You are trespassing. But since you wanted this meeting so badly, since you were so desperate to enter the inner sanctum, I will welcome you properly. I spread my arms wide, mimicking the gesture he had made when he first walked in, mocking his arrogance with my reality. Welcome to my company, brother. You are out of your mind, Preston screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek that echoed off the glass walls. He slammed his hand onto the table, rattling the silver case that held the deed to our childhood home. You are joking, right? This is some sick, twisted prank. You are a nobody. Nancy, you are a low-level clerk. You file papers and fetch coffee. You do not buy skyscrapers. He looked at our parents, desperate for validation. Dad, tell her to stop. She is having a breakdown. She is delusional. I did not shout back. I did not even raise my voice. I simply tapped the screen of my phone once more. Let us look at the evidence, shall we? I said calmly. On the massive screen behind me, the organizational chart vanished. In its place, the PDF file Preston had emailed to James reappeared. But this time, it was not the view of the bank statement, it was the back-end view. I had opened the file's properties panel, displaying the raw metadata, the digital fingerprint that every file carries, and which amateurs always forget to scrub. Digital forensics is a fascinating field, I lectured, pacing slowly around the table like a professor addressing a remedial class. You see, Preston, when you create a file, the computer stamps it with the truth, even if the image itself is a lie. I swiped up on my phone, and the image on the wall zoomed in on the author and creation date fields. Read it, Preston, I commanded. He stared at the screen, his eyes bulging. Created at 8 o'clock this morning, I read aloud, my voice cutting through the room. Application used Adobe Photoshop Creative Cloud 23.0. Do you know what legitimate bank statements are generated with enterprise database systems? Not photo editing software. I tapped the screen again. The image shifted to a zoomed-in view of the numbers, the $250,000 he was so proud of. And here is where you got lazy, I continued. Look at the kerning, the space between the 5 and the 0. The bank uses a proprietary secure font, usually a variation of Helvetica Neue or a custom serif. I pointed to the jagged, pixelated edge of the number 5. This is Arial. You pasted a generic text box over the original numbers and didn't even bother to match the typeface weight. It is sloppy. It is amateur. And frankly, it is insulting to my intelligence. Preston opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off. And the most damning part, I have access to the actual API of the bank because my holding company owns a significant stake in their commercial lending division. I pulled your real-time balance while you were stuttering about the Wi-Fi. A new window popped up on the screen. It was a direct command line query result. Green text on a black background. Account holder. Preston Willoughby, current available balance, $42.19. $42, I repeated, letting the number hang in the air like the punchline to a cruel joke. You tried to buy a partnership in a multi-million-dollar firm with the price of a mid-range steak dinner. My father let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He collapsed back into his chair, staring at the ceiling as if asking God why he hadn't struck him down sooner. And Dad, I said, turning my attention to the man who had just signed away his legacy, you just signed a legally binding deed transfer. You transferred the title of the Willoughby estate to a shell company listed as Cerberus Assets. Do you want to guess who the sole signatory of Cerberus assets is? I tapped my chest lightly. Me. My mother, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly surged to life. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward, gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. You monster, Margaret screamed. You scammed us. You scammed your own parents. How could you? We raised you. We gave you everything. And you tricked your father into signing away our home. You are a thief, Nancy. A dirty, ungrateful thief. I did not scam you, I replied, my voice dropping to a temperature that could freeze nitrogen. I intercepted a scam. There is a difference. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city below, then turned back to face them. The silhouette of my figure against the bright skyline must have looked imposing because they all shrank back slightly. Let us be clear about what happened here today, I said. Sterling and Hart, the company you walked into is a toxic asset. It is a garbage company. It is carrying $30 million in bad debt. It is under investigation by the SEC for accounting irregularities. The previous board of directors was looking for a scapegoat. They were looking for a senior partner to bring in fresh capital so they could loot it and run. I pointed at Preston. Your precious son was not being recruited because he is a genius. He was being recruited because he is a mark. He is a fool. If he had actually had the $200,000, and if he had signed those partnership papers with the old board, he would have been legally liable for the company's debts. When the SEC raided this place next week, Preston would be the one in handcuffs. He would be facing federal prison time for corporate negligence and fraud. I walked back to the table and leaned in close to my mother's face. I bought the company to control the blast radius. I bought the debt so I could fire the board and shut down the illegal operations. I am the only reason your son is not going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit for the next 15 years. I didn't steal your house, Mother. I secured it against the inevitable bankruptcy lawsuits that Preston was about to drag you into. But he is successful, my mother stammered, clinging to her delusion like a life raft. He has a trust fund, Grandma's trust fund. He manages it. He told us the returns were averaging 12% annually. I laughed. It was a dark, humorless sound. The trust fund, I asked. James, show them. James, who had been silently observing from the side, stepped forward again. He opened a second file folder he had placed on the table earlier. He spread a series of bank statements across the black marble. They were covered in red ink. This is the ledger for the Willoughby Family Trust, James stated, his voice professional and detached. Initial principal $500,000. Current balance 0. My father sat up, his eyes widening. 0, that is impossible. Preston sends us the quarterly reports. We have our dividends. He sends you fabricated reports, James corrected. Just like he fabricated that bank statement today. Look at the withdrawals, Mr. Willoughby. My father looked down at the papers. His finger traced the lines. Las Vegas, Macau, DraftKings, Porsche leasing, Rolex authorized dealer. James continued, Your son liquidated the trust 3 years ago. He has been running a Ponzi scheme on his own parents, using the last dregs of the principal to pay you small dividends to keep you from asking questions, while he gambled the rest away on sports betting and luxury rentals. No, Preston whispered. He was shaking his head, backing away toward the wall. That is not true. It was an investment high risk, high reward. The market turned against me. You spent $50,000 at a nightclub in Miami in one weekend, I said, reciting the line item from memory. You bought bottle service for strangers while I was paying Dad's medical bills last year, because he said cash flow was tight. I slammed my hand down on the table again, making them all jump. You stole from them, Preston, for years. And today you tried to commit wire fraud. You sent a forged federal document across state lines via email. James tapped the legal file in front of him. Section 1343 of Title 18, plus bank fraud, plus identity theft regarding the trust fund. If we hand this file to the FBI, which we are legally obligated to do as a financial institution that has received fraudulent documents, Preston is looking at a mandatory minimum sentence. This is not a slap on the wrist. This is federal time. My father looked at the papers, then at his son. The realization was washing over him, slow and painful. The golden boy was not just tarnished. He was rotten to the core. The genius was a criminal. The savior was a parasite. "Preston," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a heartbreak so profound it was almost hard to watch. "Is this true? Did you spend it all?" Preston's back hit the wall. He looked like a trapped rat. There was nowhere left to run. The lies had run out. The money had run out. And now, the time has run out. "I can fix it," Preston yelled, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the sweat and the bronzer. "I just need more time. Nancy, don't do this. We are family. You can't put your brother in jail." "I am not the one who put you in this position," I said, standing tall, looking down at him from the height of my moral and financial superiority. "You did this. Every single choice, every single lie, every single dollar you stole led you to this room, to this chair, to this moment. You wanted to be a big shot. Preston, you wanted to play with the Sharks. Well, congratulations. You found one." The silence in the boardroom was no longer the silence of anticipation or shock. It was the silence of a funeral. We were mourning the death of the Willoughby legacy, a corpse that my brother had been dragging around for years while pretending it was alive and well. Preston stood with his back against the wall, his chest heaving, his face a ruin of tears and running makeup. He looked at me, expecting the sister who used to cover for him to reappear. He expected Nancy to be the doormat. But Nancy was gone. She had been evicted a long time ago. "Stop crying," I said. My voice was low, devoid of sympathy. "It is pathetic, and quite frankly, it is a waste of the hydration you are going to need." I walked back to the head of the table and signaled to James. He reached into his briefcase and produced two distinct folders. One was red, one was blue. He placed them side by side on the black marble, equidistant from where Preston stood trembling. "You have two options. Preston," I announced, my voice echoing off the glass walls, "and because I am a generous host, I am going to let you choose how your story ends today." I placed my hand on the red folder. "Option A," I began, my tone sharp and clinical. "James hands this file to the FBI agents, who are currently having coffee in the lobby. It contains the forged bank statement, the metadata proving you created it, the email you sent across state lines, and the forensic accounting of the trust fund you embezzled. You will be charged with wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft, given the amount of money involved and your complete lack of remorse. The federal prosecutors will likely seek the maximum penalty. You will go to prison for at least 15 years. You will come out when you are 45, with a felony record and zero prospects." Preston whimpered, a high, thin sound like a wounded animal. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with horror. I moved my hand to the blue folder. "Option B," I continued. "Civil exile. You sign a full confession regarding the trust fund, which we will keep in a safe deposit box as insurance. You sign a document waiving any and all future claims to the Willoughby estate, inheritance, and assets. You leave this building, you leave New York City, and you leave the state. You do not contact Mom and Dad. You do not ask for money. You disappear." I paused, letting the weight of the ultimatum settle on his shoulders. "As for the house," I added, looking at my parents, "I keep the deed. It is legally mine now. Mom and Dad can continue to live there, but I own it. I will pay the utilities and the taxes. I will provide them with a monthly stipend for groceries and necessities. But the days of country clubs, luxury cars, and funding your delusions are over. They live on my budget, under my rules." "You can't do that," Preston stammered, looking at our father. Dad, say something. She is trying to banish me. She is trying to steal the family." Richard Willoughby slowly lifted his head. He looked older than I had ever seen him. The swagger was gone. The pride was gone. All that was left was a tired old man who had just realized he had bet his life on a horse that was dead before it even left the gate. He looked down at the red ink on the trust fund ledger, the proof that his son had stolen his retirement, his security, and his trust. "Dad, please," Preston begged, falling to his knees. It was a grotesque display. "I am your son. I am the partner. I can fix this. Just tell her to stop. We can sue her. We can take the house back." Richard looked at Preston. For the first time in 30 years, the fog of favoritism lifted. He didn't see a golden boy. He didn't see a tech genius or a future billionaire. He saw a thief in a cheap suit who had looked him in the eye and lied while stealing the food out of his mouth. "You stole the trust," Richard whispered. His voice was shaking, but it was clear. "Your grandmother's money, the money for our old age, you stole it all." "I borrowed it," Preston cried. "I was going to pay it back." "You made me sign over the house," Richard continued, his voice rising with a sudden, sharp anger. "You knew the money wasn't there. You made me homeless. Preston, you stood there and watched me sign away the roof over your mother's head to cover your own crimes." "Dad, Quiet," Richard roared. The sound was so loud it startled even James. My father stood up, bracing himself against the table. He looked at me. Then he looked at Preston, and the decision was made. The bond was severed. "She is right," Richard said, his voice breaking. "You are not a partner. You are not a businessman. And as of this moment, you are not my son." Preston gasped, as if he had been physically struck. "Dad." "Take the deal," Richard spat, turning his back on him. "Take the deal and get out of my sight. If you go to prison, I will not visit you. If you stay here, I will call the police myself." Preston looked to our mother. "Mom!" Margaret was sobbing, her mascara running down her cheeks in black rivers. She looked at her husband, then at the terrifying stranger who used to be her daughter. She realized that I held the keys to the house, the bank accounts, and her survival. She was a woman who valued comfort above all else, and she knew who the provider was now. She looked away, refusing to meet Preston's eyes. Preston remained on his knees for a moment longer. The reality of his isolation crashing down on him. He was alone. The safety net was gone. "I will take option B," he whispered, his voice defeated. "Wise choice," I said. James slid the papers across the floor. Preston signed them with a shaking hand. He didn't read them. He just signed his life away. Desperate to escape the room, the shame, and the threat of a cage. When he was done, I reached into my pocket. "I anticipated this outcome," I said. I tossed a small, crumpled piece of paper onto the floor in front of him. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a plane ticket. "That is a Greyhound bus ticket," I explained. "One way, destination Cleveland. It leaves from the Port Authority in 45 minutes. You have barely enough time to make it if you run." Preston picked up the ticket. He stared at it. "Bus, but I have the Porsche downstairs." "The rental agency has already repossessed the Porsche," I said coldly. "I had my assistant call them an hour ago to report it was being driven by an insolvency risk. They are towing it as we speak. You have nothing. Preston, you are starting from zero. Actually, you are starting from negative $42. I nodded to James. James pressed a button on the intercom. "Security to the boardroom." 2 seconds later, 2 large, uniformed guards entered. They didn't look like the friendly doormen downstairs. They looked like they enjoyed their jobs a little too much. "Escort Mr. Willoughby out of the building," I commanded. "If he resists, you have permission to assist him physically." "Come on, buddy," the guard grunted, grabbing Preston by the arm. Preston didn't fight. He was a shell. He let them drag him up, his feet dragging on the carpet as they hauled him toward the door. He looked back at me one last time. There was no hate in his eyes anymore, only fear, pure, unadulterated fear. He realized he had spent his whole life mocking the one person capable of destroying him. The doors closed behind him. The silence returned. I stood there, smoothing down the front of my apron. I looked at my parents. They were huddled together at the far end of the table, looking at me like I was a bomb that might explode if they made a sudden movement. "The monthly stipend will be $2,000, I said, my voice calm and businesslike. "It is enough for groceries and basic bills. I will have the heating system in the house repaired next week. I expect you to be home when the contractors arrive." "Nancy," my mother whispered, her voice trembling, We are sorry." "No," I cut her off. "You are not sorry, you are broke. There is a difference." I picked up the silver case containing the deed. I checked my watch. "This meeting is adjourned," I said. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. I didn't slam the door. I closed it gently, with a soft click that sounded like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I walked down the hallway to the private executive elevator. I pressed the button. The doors slid open smoothly. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel of the elevator walls. I didn't see a victim. I didn't see a neglected daughter. I saw a CEO. I saw a winner. I didn't smile. A smile implies happiness. And this wasn't happiness. It was satisfying. It was the feeling of balancing a ledger that had been in the red for 30 years. I bought the company. I was fired for incompetence. And I had finally, truly cleaned the house. The elevator descended, taking me down to the street where my car was waiting, leaving the 42nd floor and my former family behind in the past where they belonged. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from right now. Are you listening on your way to work, at the gym, or maybe relaxing at home? Please let me know in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed seeing justice served cold, please make sure to subscribe to the Family Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people who need a little reminder that karma always collects its debts.